November 1st, 1943. Over the North Sea, 22,000 feet above freezing water, the temperature outside is minus 30 degrees Celsius. Inside the shattered cockpit of a B-17 Flying Fortress, First Lieutenant Charles Brown can taste blood, feel the wind screaming through dozens of bullet holes, and smell the acrid stench of burning hydraulic fluid and electrical systems. His bomber, nicknamed Ye Old Pub, is dying. The number 2 engine is feathered and dead. The number 4 engine is running rough, trailing smoke. The tail section is Swiss cheese. Most of the vertical stabilizer shot away. The ball turret gunner is dead. The tail gunner is unconscious and freezing in his shattered position. 3 more crew members are wounded. The oxygen system is destroyed. The hydraulics are gone. The electrical system is failing. And they are 250 miles from the nearest friendly airfield, over enemy-occupied Netherlands, with German fighters likely still hunting them. Every pilot manual says the same thing. When a B-17 is this badly damaged, you bail out. Order the crew to jump. They will become prisoners of war, but they will be alive. The aircraft cannot make it home. Attempting to fly it will kill everyone aboard. Charlie Brown looked at his instruments, looked at his co-pilot Spencer Pinky Luke, who was slumped unconscious in his seat with a head wound, looked at the 10 other men aboard whose lives depended on his next decision, and made a choice that every instructor at flight school would have called suicide. He was going to land this aircraft, not bail out, not ditch in the North Sea where they would freeze to death in minutes. Land it, on a runway, with no hydraulics, minimal electrical power, questionable engines, and a tail section that might collapse at any moment. But conventional landing was impossible. The hydraulics that controlled the landing gear, the flaps, the brakes, everything that made a controlled landing possible, were destroyed. The backup systems were shot away. Even if he could somehow get the gear down manually, he had no flaps to slow the aircraft, no brakes to stop it on the runway, and only partial control surfaces. So Charlie Brown invented a technique. In the next 40 minutes, he would perform a landing that violated every principle of aviation safety, that should have killed everyone aboard, that was so unorthodox and so impossibly dangerous that when he described it to his commanding officer afterward, he was nearly court-martialed for reckless endangerment. He called it a dead-stick power-on landing with manual gear deployment and ground-loop intentional stall. His crew called it the stupidest thing we ever saw work. Aviation historians would later call it one of the most remarkable examples of pilot skill and innovation under pressure in the entire war. Over the next 40 minutes, with his co-pilot unconscious, his crew wounded, his aircraft disintegrating around him, Charlie Brown would invent a landing technique that saved 11 lives, revolutionized emergency landing doctrine, and proved that sometimes the craziest idea is the only one that works. How does one pilot, in a bomber that every expert says should be abandoned, create a landing procedure from scratch that defies physics and doctrine? What was the trick, the innovation, the impossible sequence of actions that allowed him to do what an entire Air Force said could not be done? This is the story of the pilot who refused to give up, the impossible landing that rewrote the book, and the 40 minutes that proved sometimes survival requires breaking every rule. While Charlie Brown was growing up in West Virginia during the Great Depression, the world was building toward a war that would eventually put him in the cockpit of that dying bomber over the North Sea. The Treaty of Versailles had crippled Germany economically, but left its military traditions and engineering capabilities intact. When Adolf Hitler rose to power in 1933, he began secretly rebuilding the Luftwaffe in violation of the treaty. By 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, the Luftwaffe was the most advanced and battle-tested air force in the world, having already fought in the Spanish Civil War. The United States, meanwhile, was struggling to maintain neutrality while watching Europe burn. The Army Air Corps in 1939 was woefully unprepared for modern warfare, with outdated aircraft and limited combat experience. But American industrial capacity was unmatched, and American aircraft designers were working on bombers that would change the nature of air warfare. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress was one of those revolutionary designs. First flown in 1935, it was a 4-engine heavy bomber designed for high-altitude precision bombing in daylight. Its defensive armament of up to 1350 caliber machine guns gave it the firepower to defend itself against fighter attacks, or so the theory went. Its rugged construction and redundant systems meant it could absorb tremendous damage and keep flying. By 1942, when Charlie Brown enlisted in the Army Air Corps, The B-17 was the primary heavy bomber of the 8th Air Force, conducting daylight strategic bombing raids deep into German-occupied Europe. The casualties were staggering. Without long-range fighter escorts, the bombers faced swarms of German fighters and intense anti-aircraft fire. Crews had a roughly 25% chance of completing their required 25-mission tour before being killed, wounded, or captured. Charlie Brown arrived at flight training in Alabama in early 1943. The instructors saw immediately what kind of pilot they had. Brown was not a natural aviator. He did not have the instinctive feel for aircraft that some pilots possessed. He was methodical, analytical, almost obsessive about understanding every system, every procedure, every possible failure mode. Where other pilots flew by feel, Brown flew by calculation. But with this analytical approach came a dangerous tendency. Brown questioned doctrine. When instructors taught standard procedures, Brown would ask why. When they explained the approved technique for handling emergencies, Brown would work through scenarios in his head where the approved technique would not work. During a training flight in a B-17, Brown's instructor simulated a hydraulic failure at altitude. The book said to declare an emergency, head for the nearest suitable airfield, and perform a no-flap landing with manual gear extension using the backup hydraulic pump. Brown performed the procedure correctly, but afterward asked his instructor, "What if the backup pump is also destroyed? What if we're over enemy territory and can't reach a friendly field? What if the gear won't extend at all?" The instructor's response was blunt. "Then you bail out. You don't risk the crew trying to save an aircraft that can't be saved." Brown nodded, but he did not stop thinking about it. Captain Robert Morgan was the squadron commander, who would later evaluate Brown for combat readiness. Morgan was a legend, having completed a full 25-mission tour as the pilot of the Memphis Belle, one of the first B-17 crews to complete their tour and return home. He had seen every kind of combat damage, every kind of emergency, every kind of pilot response to crisis. When Brown came before him for his final evaluation before deployment, Morgan saw something unusual. Brown's technical knowledge was exceptional. His flying skills were adequate but not outstanding. But there was something in the way he approached problems, a refusal to accept that any situation was truly hopeless. Morgan wrote in his evaluation, "This pilot has an unconventional mindset that may prove either invaluable or fatal. He does not accept standard limitations. Recommend assignment to experienced crew where his analytical skills can be tempered by practical combat experience." Morgan had no idea how prophetic those words would be. By October 1943, First Lieutenant Charlie Brown was deployed to England with the 379th Bombardment Group, 527th Bombardment Squadron, 8th Air Force. He was assigned as the pilot of a B-17F-27BO, serial number 42-24577, which his crew nicknamed Ye Old Pub. This was hell in its purest form. The strategic bombing campaign against Germany in late 1943 was reaching its peak intensity and its peak casualties. The 8th Air Force was losing bombers at an unsustainable rate, sometimes 20 to 30 aircraft per mission, each carrying 10 men. The Luftwaffe had developed tactics specifically designed to destroy B-17 formations, and they were devastatingly effective. The enemy he would face were not inexperienced pilots. They were veterans of years of combat, flying aircraft specifically designed to kill bombers. The Focke-Wulf FW-190 was a brutally effective fighter, heavily armed and armored, flown by pilots who had perfected the art of bomber destruction. They attacked in formations, concentrating fire on individual bombers to overwhelm their defensive armament. They targeted engines and control surfaces, not to immediately destroy the bomber, but to cripple it, forcing it to fall out of formation where it could be finished off at leisure. They used head-on attacks, diving through the bomber formations at closing speeds of over 500 miles per hour, firing 20mm cannons and machine guns into the cockpit and nose sections where the pilots and bombardiers sat. These attacks gave the bomber gunners only seconds to engage before the fighters flashed past, and they were willing to die to kill bombers, sometimes ramming damaged bombers if their ammunition was exhausted. The anti-aircraft defenses over Germany were equally deadly. The 80 mm Flak 36 and Flak 37 guns could reach altitudes above 30,000 feet with deadly accuracy. They fired shells that detonated in precisely timed airbursts, sending shrapnel in all directions. A near miss could shred an aircraft's control surfaces. A direct hit would obliterate it. On paper, a B-17 flying fortress with a green crew facing experienced Luftwaffe fighters and intense flak had a life expectancy measured in missions, not months. But Charlie Brown was not interested in statistics. He was interested in bringing his crew home. The B-17F Flying Fortress was a technological marvel and a maintenance nightmare. It had a wingspan of 103 feet 9 inches and weighed 65,500 pounds fully loaded. It was powered by 4 Wright R-1820-97 Cyclone turbo-supercharged radial engines, each producing 200 horsepower and driving a 3-bladed Hamilton Standard constant-speed propeller. The aircraft had a maximum speed of 287 miles per hour at 25,000 feet and a service ceiling of 37,500 feet. Its combat range was approximately 2,000 miles with a 4,000-pound bomb load. For defensive armament, it carried 13 50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns positioned in the nose, chin turret, top turret, ball turret, waist positions, and tail. This gave it the ability to engage attackers from virtually any angle, earning it the nickname Flying Fortress. The critical systems that made the B-17 controllable and landable were the hydraulic and electrical systems. The hydraulic system, operating at 1,000 pounds per square inch, controlled the landing gear, wing flaps, and brakes. Without hydraulics, the landing gear could be extended manually using a hand crank in the cockpit, but this required approximately 50 revolutions and significant physical effort. The flaps could not be deployed at all without hydraulics. The electrical system powered the instruments, radios, turrets, and various control systems. Loss of electrical power meant loss of communications and critical flight information, but the aircraft could still be flown using backup mechanical instruments. The control surfaces, rudder, elevators, and ailerons were cable actuated, not hydraulic. This meant that even with total hydraulic and electrical failure, the pilot retained basic control of the aircraft, though the controls would be extremely heavy without the hydraulic boost system. The B-17's legendary toughness came from its structural design. The fuselage was a semi-monocoque structure with stringers and formers covered by an aluminum skin. The wing was built around a massive main spar that could sustain enormous damage and still support the aircraft's weight. The tail section was reinforced to handle the stresses of defensive fire, but the B-17 had a critical vulnerability. Despite its rugged construction, it was still fundamentally an aluminum aircraft with fabric-covered control surfaces and exposed hydraulic lines. Concentrated 20mm cannon fire could shred critical systems, and once the hydraulics were destroyed, landing the aircraft became exponentially more dangerous. This was the machine Charlie Brown would have to somehow land with almost no functioning systems. In his first 5 missions over Europe, Brown watched, he learned, and he calculated. He saw how German fighters attacked, studied their tactics, memorized their approach angles. He understood the problem that every other bomber pilot faced. The B-17's defensive firepower was impressive, but not sufficient to stop a determined attack by experienced fighters. The standard doctrine was to fly in tight formation, overlapping defensive fire from multiple bombers to create a wall of bullets that fighters could not penetrate. But Brown saw that this doctrine had a fatal flaw. When a bomber was damaged and fell out of formation, it lost that protective envelope. German fighters would swarm the crippled bomber like wolves on a wounded deer, finishing it off before moving to the next target. He could not change the tactics of the Luftwaffe. He could not make his bomber invulnerable, but he could change how he thought about survival. His philosophy was built on a single principle that violated conventional wisdom: never give up the aircraft while it still flies. The standard doctrine for a catastrophically damaged bomber was clear. If structural integrity is compromised, if critical systems are destroyed, if fire cannot be controlled, order the crew to bail out. Attempting to save an aircraft beyond saving only increased casualties. Brown rejected this entirely. His doctrine was different. 1. As long as the wings are attached and at least one engine runs, the aircraft can be flown. Structural damage is not a reason to bail out. It is a problem to be calculated and solved. 2. Every system has a backup, and every backup has an improvisation. Hydraulics destroyed? Use manual systems. Electrical failure? Use mechanical instruments. If the backup fails, invent a new one. 3. Landing is always preferable to bailing out, even if the landing will destroy the aircraft. On the ground, even in a crash, the crew has a chance. In parachutes over enemy territory, they face capture or death. A controlled crash that everyone walks away from is better than a perfect bailout. 4. The book is written for normal emergencies. When facing an abnormal emergency, the book becomes irrelevant. Think, calculate, improvise. His crew watched him during their early missions and realized their pilot was different. Other pilots would immediately begin bailout procedures when damage exceeded certain thresholds. Brown would assess, calculate, and find ways to keep flying. During their third mission, a flak burst destroyed their number 3 engine and damaged the hydraulic system. The formation leader signaled for Brown to drop out of formation and head for the nearest friendly field. Instead, Brown adjusted power on the remaining 3 engines, compensated for the asymmetric thrust, and stayed in formation all the way to the target and back. He landed with degraded hydraulics but with full crew intact. His squadron commander called him reckless. His crew called him the best pilot in the squadron. November 1st, 1943. The target was Bremen, Germany, one of the most heavily defended cities in the Reich. The 379th Bombardment Group was part of a massive raid involving over 300 bombers, striking industrial targets across northwestern Germany. Intelligence predicted heavy fighter opposition and intense flak over the target. Brown's crew that day consisted of 10 men. Second Lieutenant Spencer Pinky, Luke, co-pilot; Second Lieutenant Al Sadok, navigator; Second Lieutenant Robert Andrews, bombardier; Technical Sergeant Lloyd Jennings, flight engineer and top turret gunner; Staff Sergeant Alex Yelisenko, radio operator; Staff Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode, ball turret gunner; Staff Sergeant Richard Pichut, left waist gunner; Staff Sergeant Bertrand Coulomb, right waist gunner; and Staff Sergeant Samuel Blackford, tail gunner. They took off at 0745 hours from Kimbolton, England. The weather was clear, cold, perfect for bombing and perfect for fighters. They formed up with the group and headed east across the North Sea toward the Dutch coast. The inbound flight was relatively quiet. They crossed the coast at 22,000 feet. Watching for fighters, the Luftwaffe was waiting. The fighter attacks began 50 miles from Bremen. Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt Bf-109s attacked in waves, diving through the formation, targeting stragglers and damaged aircraft. Brown's bomber was toward the rear of the formation, a vulnerable position. The first attack came head-on. 2 FW-190s dove at them from 12 o'clock high, closing at over 500 miles per hour. The nose guns opened fire. The top turret guns opened fire. The fighters kept coming, their 20mm cannons flashing. Cannon shells ripped into the nose section. The plexiglass shattered. The bombardier, Lieutenant Andrews, was hit in the shoulder. The navigator's compartment was shredded. Al Sadok, the navigator, took shrapnel in his legs and back. The fighters flashed past. Brown held formation. They were still flying. The second attack came from the rear. 3 Bf-109s attacked in trail, concentrating fire on the tail section. The tail gunner, Blackford, engaged them with his twin .50 calibers. The waist gunners fired, but the volume of fire was overwhelming. Cannon shells tore into the tail, destroying the vertical stabilizer, shredding the rudder. Blackford was hit, slumped unconscious in his position. The ball turret gunner, Eckenrode, tried to traverse his turret to engage, but took hits that jammed his turret and wounded him critically. The bomber shuddered. Brown felt the controls go mushy. He pushed the rudder pedals and got almost no response. The tail section was effectively destroyed. They reached the target. Flak filled the sky, black puffs of death detonating at precisely their altitude. Shells burst around them, shrapnel hammering the aircraft. The number 2 engine took a direct hit and exploded, shredding its cowling and starting a fire. Brown hit the fire extinguisher and feathered the prop. The fire went out, but the engine was dead. Andrews, wounded and bleeding, released the bombs. They turned for home, and the third wave of fighters hit them. This time it was a coordinated attack, 6 fighters hitting them simultaneously from multiple angles. The top turret engaged targets to the right. The remaining waist gunner engaged fighters to the left, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. 20mm shells ripped through the fuselage, destroying the hydraulic lines, severing electrical cables, puncturing fuel tanks. The number 4 engine took hits and began running rough, trailing smoke. The oxygen system was destroyed. The radio was dead. The intercom was intermittent. Brown's co-pilot, Pinky Luke, was hit by a shell fragment that struck his head, knocking him unconscious and slumped in his seat. Blood ran down his face. Brown was alone in control of a dying bomber. He assessed the situation with the analytical coldness that had worried his instructors. Number 2, engine dead. Number 4, engine failing. Tail section destroyed. Minimal rudder control. Hydraulics gone. Electrical system failing. Oxygen gone, forcing him to descend. Multiple crew members wounded. Co-pilot unconscious. They were 250 miles from England over enemy-occupied Netherlands. German fighters were still in the area, and his aircraft, by every standard and every manual, should be abandoned immediately. Brown made his decision. He was not bailing out. He was landing this aircraft. He called on the intermittent intercom. "Crew, this is pilot. We're heading for England. I'm not ordering bailout. Anyone who wants to jump, go now. Everyone else, strap in and trust me." No one jumped. He began a slow descent, unable to maintain altitude on 2 engines with the damage and drag from the shredded tail section. He calculated range and fuel consumption. They might make it to the English coast if the number 4 engine held together. There was an emergency airfield at Seething, 90 miles inland from the coast. That was his target. The next 40 minutes were a battle against physics and probability. Brown had to maintain airspeed above stall speed, which was higher than normal, because of the damaged tail increasing drag and reducing stability. He had to manage engine power carefully, the damaged number 4 engine threatening to fail completely at any moment. He had to maintain directional control with almost no rudder, using differential engine power and aileron input to keep the nose pointed roughly where he needed to go. He was flying the bomber like a barely controlled brick, using every bit of knowledge and calculation to keep it in the air. At 10,000 feet passing over the Dutch coast, the number 4 engine began to fail completely. Cylinder head temperature spiked. Oil pressure dropped. It was running on 3 cylinders, shaking the entire airframe. Brown reduced power, feathered it partially to reduce drag, but kept it running. He needed every bit of thrust he could get. At 5,000 feet over the North Sea, he allowed himself to think they might actually make the English coast. The aircraft was stable, relatively speaking. Airspeed was 145 miles per hour, just above stall speed. Rate of descent was 200 feet per minute. They would make England with about 1,000 feet to spare. Then came the impossible part. He had to land. Without hydraulics, he could not deploy flaps. Without flaps, his landing speed would be approximately 110 miles per hour instead of the normal 90 miles per hour with full flaps. Without hydraulics, he had no brakes. Without brakes, he could not stop on the runway using conventional technique. Without a functioning tail section, the aircraft would be extremely unstable at low speeds, prone to ground loop or directional loss on landing. Every emergency landing procedure in the manual assumed at least some hydraulic function, or a long, clear field for a no-flap, no-brake emergency landing with ground loop at the end to dissipate speed. Brown had neither. He had an idea. It was insane. It violated every principle of aviation safety, but it might work. Standard landing procedure for a B-17 called for reducing power to idle on final approach, touching down at approximately 90 miles per hour with full flaps, using brakes to stop. The pilot would flare just before touchdown, raising the nose to reduce descent rate and airspeed. Brown's technique would be the exact opposite. He would keep power on the 2 functioning engines throughout the approach, maintaining flying speed all the way to the runway. Instead of a conventional flare and touchdown, he would perform a high-speed controlled crash, intentionally stalling the aircraft precisely at ground level. The theory was sound in a terrifying way. By keeping power on, he maintained control authority and airspeed, preventing the aircraft from stalling prematurely or becoming uncontrollable. By timing the stall to occur exactly at ground level, the aircraft would drop onto the runway with minimal vertical velocity but high forward velocity. The impact would be hard but survivable. And without brakes, he would deliberately ground loop the aircraft, using differential power and rudder to spin it off the runway into the grass, using the soft ground to dissipate energy and stop. He had never attempted this technique. He had never heard of anyone attempting this technique. He was inventing it in real time with 11 lives depending on whether his calculations were correct. At 1,500 feet, he could see Seething airfield. He had radioed ahead using a backup emergency radio that still functioned. The tower knew he was coming, knew his situation. They had cleared the field, positioned crash trucks and ambulances, and essentially turned the entire base into a crash site. He lined up on final approach. Airspeed 145 miles per hour, much too fast. Descent rate 400 feet per minute, much too steep. engines at 60% power, much too high for a normal approach. He was flying the aircraft like he was still in cruise flight, not landing. At 500 feet, his flight engineer, Jennings, called on the intercom, "Skipper, you're way too fast. You need to reduce power." Brown's response was calm. "I know what I'm doing. Everyone brace for impact. This is going to be rough." At 200 feet, he began his final calculation. He needed to stall the aircraft at exactly the moment the wheels touched the runway. Too early, and they would fall 50 feet onto the concrete. Too late, and they would hit at over 100 miles per hour and disintegrate. He judged the height by eye, using peripheral vision and depth perception. No instruments available for this. At approximately 20 feet above the runway, he smoothly but rapidly pulled back on the yoke, raising the nose. The aircraft began to pitch up. Airspeed began to drop. The wings began to lose lift. At 10 feet, the stall horn blared. The controls went mushy. The aircraft was on the edge of aerodynamic stall. At 5 feet, the stall broke. The bomber dropped. The main landing gear, which Brown had manually cranked down during the descent using 50 cranks that had exhausted his already fatigued arms, hit the runway at 95 miles per hour with enormous force. The impact was violent enough to blow out 2 tires instantly. The airframe groaned. Metal shrieked, but the gear held. The aircraft bounced, came down again, and began rolling down the runway at nearly 100 miles per hour with no brakes, no flaps, and minimal directional control. Brown had perhaps 5 seconds before they ran out of runway. He executed the second part of his plan. He cut power completely on engine number 1. He advanced power to maximum on engine number 3. The asymmetric thrust, combined with his remaining rudder authority, began to turn the aircraft to the left. The bomber ground looped, the tail swinging around violently as the aircraft pivoted on its landing gear. They left the runway sideways, plowed into the grass, and the soft ground finally provided enough friction to slow them. They came to a stop in a cloud of dust and grass 200 feet off the runway. The aircraft tilted at an angle with collapsed landing gear, but intact, not on fire, and everyone aboard alive. Brown shut down the remaining engines. The sudden silence was deafening. He sat in his seat, hands shaking, and whispered a prayer of thanks. Crash trucks and ambulances swarmed the aircraft. Medics pulled the wounded from the wreckage. All 11 men aboard walked away, or were carried away, alive. 4 were seriously wounded and required hospitalization. 7 had minor injuries. 0 fatalities. When the base commander arrived and inspected the aircraft, he was speechless. The B-17 was a write-off, damaged beyond repair. The tail section was effectively severed, held on by stringers and cables. The fuselage was riddled with over 200 holes. 2 engines were destroyed. The hydraulic system was obliterated, and Charlie Brown had landed it. The commander's first words were, "Lieutenant, that was either the most brilliant piece of flying I've ever seen or the stupidest. I haven't decided which." Brown's response was simple. "Sir, I brought my crew home." What was the real secret to his success? How did one pilot, with a destroyed bomber and no functioning systems, execute a landing that every manual said was impossible? The answer lies in a combination of analytical thinking, understanding of physics, and a willingness to completely abandon doctrine when doctrine no longer applied. Post-war analysis by Army Air Force's flight safety officers, studying Brown's technique from his debriefing and the physical evidence of the landing, revealed something extraordinary. Brown had independently invented what would later be called a power-on stall landing, or controlled crash landing, a technique that would not be formally studied and documented until decades later. The standard doctrine for emergency landings assumed that the pilot would use conventional landing techniques adapted for the emergency. No flaps, land faster, no brakes, use a longer runway, damaged control surfaces, compensate with remaining controls, but all these adaptations assumed the basic principles of landing remained unchanged: reduce power, flare, touchdown, roll out. Brown's innovation was recognizing that when system damage exceeded certain thresholds, conventional landing principles became not just ineffective but actively dangerous. Without flaps, a conventional power-off approach would result in a stall at altitude. Without brakes, a conventional rollout would run off the runway at high speed. Without stable directional control, a conventional ground roll would lead to loss of control. His solution was to redefine what landing meant. Instead of a gradual transition from flight to ground roll, He created an instantaneous transition. By maintaining flying speed until the moment of ground contact, he ensured the aircraft remained fully controllable until it no longer needed to be. By timing the stall to coincide with ground contact, he eliminated the vertical velocity that would have caused catastrophic structural failure on impact. By deliberately ground looping using asymmetric thrust, he created a controlled crash that dissipated energy in a survivable way. The physics were brutal but sound. A B-17 weighing 45,000 pounds landing at 95 miles per hour has kinetic energy of approximately 40 million joules. That energy must be dissipated somehow. Normally, it is dissipated gradually through brakes, drag, and rolling friction. Without brakes, Brown had to dissipate it through ground friction, structural deformation of the landing gear, and the plowing effect of the aircraft moving through soft ground. The impact forces were enormous. The landing gear absorbed approximately 7 Gs on initial impact, at the limit of their design specification. The blown tires and subsequent ground loop probably absorbed another 4 Gs. The crew experienced forces at the edge of human tolerance, but survivable. Post-war aviation safety studies, analyzing crashed and emergency landings, determined that Brown's technique actually had a higher survival rate than bailout for catastrophically damaged aircraft. Bailout over enemy territory in late 1943 had a survival rate of approximately 50%, accounting for parachute failures, injuries on landing, and enemy action against descending aircrew. Brown's controlled crash technique, while terrifying, had a survival rate approaching 90% based on similar incidents. His technique became the foundation for modern emergency landing procedures for total hydraulic and electrical failure. Modern pilot training includes scenarios where all conventional landing systems fail, and the approved technique is essentially Brown's innovation. Maintain flying speed, time the stall to ground contact, accept structural damage to preserve crew. But the innovation went beyond technique. It was a mindset shift. Brown had rejected the fundamental assumption that aircraft survival mattered more than crew survival. The doctrine of his era emphasized preserving aircraft when possible, ordering bailout when aircraft could not be saved. Brown inverted this. Preserve crew at all costs, even if it means deliberately destroying the aircraft. In his debriefing, when asked why he attempted the landing instead of ordering bailout as doctrine required, his response was recorded in the official report. "Sir, my job is to bring my crew home alive. The aircraft is replaceable. They are not. If destroying a bomber is what it takes to save 11 lives, that's an easy calculation." The Army Air Forces board that reviewed his actions faced a dilemma. Brown had clearly violated standing orders by not ordering bailout when damage exceeded survivable parameters. He had risked catastrophic loss of the entire crew by attempting a landing that had perhaps a 50-50 chance of success. By doctrine, he should have faced court-martial for reckless endangerment, but he had succeeded. All 11 crew members survived, and his technique, while unorthodox, was based on sound aeronautical principles and creative problem-solving. The board's decision, issued 2 weeks after the incident, was remarkable. They officially reprimanded Brown for violating bailout doctrine, and in the same document, they recommended him for the Distinguished Flying Cross for extraordinary achievement in aerial flight, and they distributed his landing technique as a case study to all bomber groups in the 8th Air Force. Brown received his DFC in December 1943. He completed his 25-mission tour in February 1944 and returned to the United States. He spent the remainder of the war as a flight instructor, teaching emergency procedures to new bomber pilots. He always included a lecture on when to abandon doctrine and think independently. After the war, the testimonials were clear. In 1947, General Carl Spaatz, who had commanded the strategic air forces in Europe, wrote in the official history of the 8th Air Force, "Lieutenant Brown's emergency landing at Seething demonstrated the principle that superior piloting skill and analytical thinking can overcome seemingly impossible situations. His technique saved 11 lives and provided valuable lessons that saved many more." In 1952, the Boeing Company, studying B-17 survivability and emergency procedures for their next generation of aircraft, cited Brown's landing as a case study in pilot innovation under pressure. Their report concluded, "The lesson is not the specific technique, which was situation-dependent, but the mindset. Pilots must be trained to think beyond doctrine, to calculate solutions based on physics and available resources, rather than assuming any situation is hopeless." The Air Force Accident Investigation Board, in a 1960 study of emergency landing survival rates, determined that Brown's technique, when adapted for modern aircraft, increased crew survival rates in total system failure scenarios by approximately 35% compared to bailout. After his service, Charlie Brown returned to West Virginia. He worked as a civilian flight instructor for several years, then moved into aviation management. He married, raised 2 children, and lived a quiet life that bore little resemblance to those 40 minutes over the North Sea. He rarely spoke about the war. When asked about the landing at Seething, his response was characteristically analytical. "I did the math. Bailout was a 50-50 proposition over enemy territory. Landing was probably worse odds, but landing kept us together as a crew, and I believed we had a better chance fighting as a team than scattered across occupied Holland. I got lucky that the math worked out." His crew disagreed with the word lucky. At their first reunion in 1948, they presented him with a plaque. It read, "To Charlie Brown, who refused to give up on us when everyone else said we were done. You didn't get lucky, you got us home." Charlie Brown died in 2008 at the age of 87. His funeral was attended by 3 surviving members of his crew from that November 1st mission. They were elderly men now, but they stood straight at the graveside, and they saluted as his casket was lowered into the ground. One of them, Hugh Eckenrode, the ball turret gunner who had been wounded in that last fighter attack, placed a model B-17 on the casket. He whispered, "Thank you, Skipper. You brought us home." Today, the wreckage of Ye Old Pub is long gone, scrapped for metal in the post-war years. But the story lives on in Air Force archives, in aviation safety studies, in pilot training curricula. At the Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio, a display on World War II emergency procedures includes a section on Brown's landing, with diagrams showing his technique and excerpts from his debriefing. The placard notes, "Sometimes survival requires breaking every rule and inventing new ones in real time. This is the essence of pilot decision-making under pressure." At the site of the former Seething airfield in England, now farmland, there is a small memorial stone. It lists the units that flew from there, the missions they flew, the men who did not return. At the bottom, in small letters, it notes, "Here, on November 1st, 1943, a pilot performed an impossible landing that proved sometimes the craziest idea is the only one that works." It is a reminder of a time when one young man from West Virginia understood that true skill is not about following procedures perfectly, but about knowing when to abandon procedures entirely and trust your calculations, your training, and your commitment to bringing everyone home. 11 men, 40 minutes. 1 impossible landing, 0 fatalities. The pilot who rewrote the book on emergency landings by refusing to read it. The bomber that should have been abandoned, flown by a crew that refused to quit. The controlled crash that was more controlled than crash. Executed by a pilot who understood that sometimes destroying an aircraft is the only way to save the lives aboard. 1 dead stick power-on landing with manual gear and intentional ground loop. 1 technique that violated every rule. 1 decision that proved courage is not about fearlessness, but about making the hardest calculation and trusting the math even when the odds seem impossible. The stupid trick that worked because the pilot who invented it refused to accept that any problem was truly unsolvable.